By the quiet mechanics of money, logistics, and balance sheets, for 20 years after World War II, the world ran on a promise that only worked if no one ever tested it. When one country finally did, the system revealed its true design. What followed wasn't a collapse by accident. It was a forced sequence, a chain reaction where every move narrowed the options, increased the pressure. Most people believe the U.S.'s dollar became dominant because it was strong, stable, and trusted. That belief is comforting. It is also incomplete. In reality, the dollar survived because the system built around it could no longer tolerate limits. And when limits reappeared, they weren't negotiated with, they were removed. In 1965, a French warship entered New York Harbor to collect gold. By the quiet mechanics of money, logistics, and balance sheets, for 20 years after World War II, the world ran on a promise that only worked if no one ever tested it. When one country finally did, the system revealed its true design. What followed wasn't a collapse by accident. It was a forced sequence, a chain reaction where every move narrowed the options, increased the pressure, and made reversal impossible. By the end, the rules themselves would be rewritten not because they failed, but because they worked too well. To understand how money stopped answering to reality, and why that change still shapes the world you live in, you have to see the mechanism that made it inevitable. And once you see it, the outcome stops being surprising at all. After World War II, the global economy didn't stabilize because leaders agreed on principles. It stabilized because a single constraint made coordination possible: gold. The United States held most of it, and that fact, not ideology, made the dollar acceptable. Bretton Woods wasn't a vision. It was a balance sheet. Every major currency pointed inward toward the dollar, and the dollar pointed downward toward gold. As long as that link held, expansion had a ceiling. That ceiling was the system's anchor. For a while, the pressure stayed below the threshold. Europe rebuilt. Japan industrialized. Trade accelerated. Dollars flowed outward to grease the machinery of recovery. This looked like generosity. It was actually structural necessity. The world needed liquidity, and only one country could supply it. The more successful the system became, the more currency it demanded, and each new dollar was a claim layered onto the same finite reserve beneath it. This is where the mechanism asserts itself. A system that grows by issuing claims faster than it can settle them does not break suddenly. It stretches. The danger is not mismanagement. It's arithmetic. By the early 1960s, the volume of dollars held abroad no longer matched the gold available for redemption. The promise still existed, but it could no longer be fulfilled universally. The system continued only because no one forced settlement. France did not act out of hostility, it acted out of exposure. French officials observed American corporations purchasing real assets overseas using currency created at no marginal cost. Physical industry was being exchanged for paper claims that depended entirely on collective restraint. France calculated that restraint was eroding. Waiting increased risk, acting early reduced it. The decision wasn't political, it was logistical. When France began converting dollars into gold in 1965, it did not violate the system. It activated it. The rules allowed redemption. They simply assumed it wouldn't happen. Gold, leaving American vaults, reintroduced the very constraint the system was designed to suppress. And once that constraint reappeared, expectations changed everywhere. Other countries didn't need to imitate France immediately. They only needed to recognize that the exit was real. From that point forward, the sequence became mechanical. Gold outflows tightened margins. Defensive measures followed. The London gold pool attempted to hold the official price by selling reserves into rising demand. This bought time while accelerating depletion. The United States pressured allies to hold dollars, tying monetary compliance to security guarantees. These moves slowed redemption, but they could not restore belief. The system now relied on enforcement rather than confidence. By the late 1960s, the structure had crossed its point of no return. Any large redemption would expose insolvency. Any refusal would expose default. The United States faced a forced choice between two unacceptable outcomes: honor the promise and lose monetary control, or break the promise and rewrite the system. The original framework could not survive either path. In 1971, the choice was made. The gold window was closed, officially described as temporary, structurally final. This was not a failure of the system. It was its logical endpoint. The constraint was removed, money no longer required settlement, only acceptance. And acceptance was maintained through trade dependence, financial infrastructure, and geopolitical reach. From that moment on, money stopped answering to metal. It answered to power. And once that shift occurred, There was no mechanism left to reverse it. The immediate aftermath looked like disorder, but it wasn't chaos. It was reorganization under a new rule set. Exchange rates floated, currencies disconnected, markets recalibrated. What appeared unstable was actually the system adapting to the removal of its final constraint. Gold had enforced discipline through settlement. Without it, discipline was no longer structural. It became discretionary. France emerged holding metal. The United States emerged holding the architecture. One secured value, the other secured control. Gold rose in price because it was no longer suppressed. The dollar fell, then stabilized. Not because it was trusted, but because it was embedded everywhere. Trade contracts, energy pricing, debt markets, clearing systems. Once money becomes infrastructure, opting out is no longer a realistic option. This is the part usually misunderstood. The United States did not abandon gold because gold failed. It abandoned gold because gold worked. It imposed limits at the exact moment those limits became incompatible with the global scale. Military commitments and domestic political demands. The constraint wasn't mismanaged. It was removed because it could no longer be absorbed. From that point forward, monetary stability no longer came from settlement. It came from circulation. As long as dollars kept moving, the system held, inflation became the release valve. Debt replaced payment, time substituted for resolution. These were not policy errors. They were structural adaptations to a world where limits had been deliberately erased. The deeper pattern is simple and repeatable. Systems expand until they encounter a boundary. When the boundary holds, power must adjust. When the boundary can be removed, it is. Bretton Woods didn't collapse because of personalities or bad decisions. It collapsed because it reached a scale where its constraint reasserted itself. And power responded in the only way it reliably does. The gold still exists, it still settles accounts, it simply no longer governs the system. What governs now is acceptance, dependence, and reach. The same mechanism appears whenever infrastructure grows faster than its limits. Energy, debt, supply chains. The pattern does not announce itself. It reveals itself only when settlement is demanded. That is what France did in 1965. It demanded settlement in a system that could no longer tolerate it. Everything that followed was forced. And once the constraint was removed, there was no technical path back, only new layers built on top of the decision. The story does not end with victory or failure. It ends with the replacement. Limits did not disappear. They were relocated. And systems that survive by removing limits do not become safer. They become quieter, until the next boundary reappears. What remains is not a lesson, but a condition. After 1971, money no longer needed to be settled. It needed to circulate. As long as claims moved forward, the system stayed upright. The future absorbed what the present could not pay. This wasn't deception, it was design. Debt became the mechanism that allowed growth without resolution. Inflation became the pressure release. And time replaced accountability. The structure rewarded expansion and punished restraint. Countries that accumulated dollars had to recycle them or lose value. Surpluses became vulnerabilities. Dependence deepened quietly. Through trade, finance, and infrastructure. The system no longer asked whether obligation could be honored. It only asked whether participation could be avoided. For most, it could not. This is why the gold under Paris matters. Not because it changed the outcome, but because it marked the last successful demand for settlement. After that moment, settlement itself became optional for those who controlled the system. The constraint wasn't defeated in argument, it was bypassed in structure. Nothing about this required conspiracy. No secret coordination. Just incentives aligned with scale. Once money became global infrastructure, enforcing limits became incompatible with maintaining dominance. The choice was not moral, it was mechanical. Either submit to settlement and shrink, or remove settlement and expand. Power chose expansion. That choice still governs the present. Modern finance is faster, deeper, more abstract, but the mechanism is unchanged. Growth still outruns limits. Limits still reappear. And when they do, they are not addressed directly. They are deferred, relocated, or renamed. The surface narrative changes. The structure does not. This is why history doesn't repeat as events. It repeats as patterns. The names change. The instruments evolve. But the pressure points stay familiar. When a system can no longer tolerate settlement, it will redefine what settlement means. When it can no longer accept limits, it will find ways to move them elsewhere. In 1965, France forced the system to confront a boundary. In 1971, that boundary was removed. Everything since has been built on that decision. Quietly, logically, inevitably. and systems built this way don't collapse loudly, they persist until the next limit appears and asks to be paid. And that is the unsettled part of the story. The system that emerged after 1971 did not promise truth, it promised continuity. As long as transactions cleared, growth continued, and obligations rolled forward, stability was declared, resolution was no longer required, only motion. This created a world where crises are not resolved, only absorbed, where imbalance is not corrected, only distributed, and where accountability is delayed until it becomes abstract. What looks like resilience is often just deferral. Pressure is pushed forward in time, outward across borders, or downward through financial layers few people ever see. The structure holds not because it is sound, but because it is embedded. Money is no longer a measure. It is an environment, and environments are difficult to escape even when they are unstable. This is why moments like 1965 matter, not because they changed the destination, but because they revealed the rule. When settlement was demanded, the system could not comply without shrinking, so it chose to transform instead. That decision hardened into precedent, and precedent quietly becomes law. The official story says the gold standard ended because it was impractical. The structure says it ended because it worked too well. It enforced limits at a scale where limits were no longer tolerable. That tension has not disappeared. It has only been displaced into debt markets, into currency hierarchies, into systems where resolution is endlessly postponed. Nothing here requires belief, only observation. Systems grow, constraints return, power responds by moving the boundary, and each time that happens, the distance between value and reality grows wider, not smaller. The gold beneath Paris does not challenge the system. It does not need to. It simply exists as proof that settlement was once unavoidable, and that when it became unavoidable again, it was removed instead. That is not a warning. It is a condition, and conditions do not ask permission before they reassert themselves. The years between 1966 and 1968 are often described as a pause, a period of management. In reality, they were a compression phase. Pressure was no longer building evenly, it was concentrating. Every month, the United States defended the system. It did so by spending the very asset meant to anchor it. Gold was no longer a reserve. It was a shield being chipped away. What made this phase dangerous wasn't panic, it was discipline. Allies did not revolt, they complied. Germany held its dollars. Japan stayed quiet. Britain delayed as long as it could. This restraint is usually framed as loyalty. Structurally, it was fear. Everyone understood the same equation. If redemption became simultaneous, everyone would lose. So coordination replaced confidence. Silence replaced belief. But silence is not stability. It is suspension. The system required constant motion without settlement. Dollars had to circulate outward, faster than gold exited inward. The moment circulation slowed, pressure returned to the vaults. This is why the United States expanded controls, capital restrictions, moral suasion, diplomatic warnings. None of these addressed the core issue. They only redistributed the burden of holding claims. The London gold pool is often remembered as cooperation. In practice, it was triage. Governments sold gold to suppress price signals that would have revealed the imbalance instantly. Every sale stabilized the number while weakening the structure beneath it. The official price remained $35 an ounce. The unofficial truth drifted further away. Markets sensed the gap even if they could not yet exploit it fully. By 1968, the pool collapsed, not with an announcement, but with exhaustion. There was no more metal to sacrifice without accelerating the very outcome it was meant to prevent. At that point, the system entered a terminal phase. Gold convertibility still existed on paper, but functionally, it was already gone. The rule had not been revoked. It had become unusable. This is the moment often misunderstood. The collapse was not caused by Nixon, it preceded him. What Nixon inherited was not a choice between good and bad options. It was a choice between visibility and denial. The system had already failed its constraint test. The only question was how openly that failure would be acknowledged. Behind closed doors, the discussion was no longer about gold. It was about scale, the American economy, its military commitments, and its political promises could not contract fast enough to realign with settlement. Adjustment would have required recession, withdrawal, and domestic upheaval. The cost of honoring the promise exceeded the cost of breaking it. Once that ratio flips, outcomes are no longer debated. They are selected. This is what defines a point of no return. Not a decision, but an asymmetry so large that reversal becomes self-destructive. At that stage, systems do not correct, they mutate. After 1971, the new system did not announce itself clearly. There was no replacement conference, no single doctrine. Instead, architecture quietly took over. The dollar remained central not because of agreement, but because removing it would have required rebuilding everything it touched: trade invoicing, energy pricing, debt issuance, payment rails. The cost of exit became higher than the cost of compliance. This is why the post-gold system appears paradoxical. It is both flexible and rigid. Flexible in value, rigid in structure. Currencies float, but hierarchy remains. Volatility is permitted, displacement is not. The system absorbs shock by spreading it, not resolving it. Crisis becomes recurring rather than terminal. This also explains why inflation replaced settlement. Inflation does not demand payment. It dilutes it. It allows obligation to be honored nominally while being adjusted in real terms. It is not a flaw. It is a feature of a system that cannot tolerate closure. Debt performs the same function across time. What cannot be settled now is rolled forward, priced, and normalized. None of this required malice, only continuity. Once gold was removed, nothing remained to enforce restraint externally. Restraint became optional, and optional restraint is rarely chosen under pressure, especially by systems designed to grow. France's gold does not challenge this structure. It sits outside it. That is its significance. It marks the boundary between two regimes, one where settlement defined credibility, and one where credibility is defined by participation. In the first, limits were explicit. In the second, they are displaced. This displacement is why modern crises feel unresolved. They are managed, not closed. Liquidity replaces payment. Intervention replaces settlement. Each solution preserves motion while pushing resolution further out of reach. The system survives by never finishing its own accounting. This is the repeating pattern. Growth reaches a boundary. The boundary becomes visible. Power intervenes not to restore balance, but to relocate the limit. The surface stabilizes. The structure accumulates tension elsewhere. And because the relocation works temporarily, it becomes precedent. The gold beneath Paris does not predict collapse. It records a transition. The moment when settlement became intolerable, and the removal became rational. That decision still governs the present, quietly, mechanically, without intent. The story does not end here because structures like this do not end cleanly. They persist by design, until the next constraint emerges in a place that cannot be bypassed. And when it does, it will not announce itself as history. It will appear first as accounting, only later will it be named. If this story felt unfamiliar, that's not because it was hidden. It's because most history is taught as events, not constraints. Names change, dates change, the mechanisms don't. This channel exists to examine those mechanisms: money, infrastructure, logistics, power under pressure, not as opinions, as structures that repeat whether we notice them or not. If you want to understand history at the level where outcomes stop being surprising, stay here. Because the next episode won't begin with what happened, it'll begin with what made it unavoidable. And once you see that layer, the official story never feels complete again.